Thank you, Santosh. Thank you, Dr. Mahanti. I'd like to introduce just briefly our two guest speakers and ask them to please come to the podium. The format, ladies and gentlemen, this evening is each will be given an opportunity to speak for 15 minutes to lay out their vision, their view of the topic this evening, and each will be given a 5-minute rebuttal to respond. And then we're going to open it up to Q&A, and you have the yellow cards on your tables, so if you can complete those, we'll be reading those questions. Please keep them short. It's easier to read the questions if they're short and concise, and print. Please print. It's easier to read for me. And so we're going to do that. And now their bios, the two speakers, Dr. Jasser and Mr. Mariotti, their bios are in the programs. But just a few things I'd like to say in terms of highlighting each of our esteemed speakers is Dr. Jasser founded the AIFD in the wake of the 9/11 attacks on the United States as an effort to provide an American Muslim voice advocating for the preservation of the founding principles of the U.S. Constitution. He is a first-generation American Muslim whose parents fled the oppressive Ba'ath regime of Syria in the mid-1960s. As I listened to both of them at our table, Mr. Mariotti's parents also fled the Ba'ath regime, but that was in Iraq, I believe. And so there's some commonality there, fleeing oppression. Dr. Jasser's passion, he believes, is that he is leading the fight to shake the hold that the Muslim Brotherhood and their network of American Islamist organizations and mosques seek to exert on the organized Islam in America. So I believe, and I'll let Jasser speak for himself, he believes he is fighting for the soul of Islam in the West. Mr. Mariotti is nationally recognized for his commitment to improving the public understanding of Islam and policies impacting American Muslims. He is the president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And just a moment, I've seen both of these gentlemen on Fox News, maybe CNN. Can you hear them both? I don't know if you're allowed to. Yeah. But so these. If
you're not paid.
I'm sorry?
If you're not paid.
Well, but the point is, both of these gentlemen are nationally renowned for their advocacy on what they believe in and what their cause is. And and I know, Salam, I've seen you on television, maybe more on CNN, I don't know, but maybe. He is also a board member of the Muslim Reform Institute. He oversees MPAC's groundbreaking civic engagement, public policy, and advocacy work. He's an expert on Islam in the West, the Muslim reform movements, human rights, democracy, national security, and the Middle East policy. He has spoken at the White House, Capitol Hill, and represented the U.S. at international human rights and religious freedom conferences. And if I'm correct, Mr. Mariotti, I believe President Obama sent you to one of the conferences that dealt with the issue of human rights in 2013. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, in Warsaw. Right.
Warsaw, okay. His writings have appeared in every major national news publication, as have both of them. And so please join me, ladies and gentlemen, welcoming our two distinguished guest speakers. Gentlemen, you have the microphones there. Dr. Jasser, I believe you will go first, and Mr. Mariotti then will go, and then we'll proceed from there. So,
Can we speak from there first?
oh, yes. In fact, that's a better idea. So why don't you come up here, and then we'll do the same thing with Mr. Mariotti so that you have a podium and have your notes. All right.
Thank you, Serge. Thank you, Dr. Mahanti, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to join the World Affairs Council. I've spoken to a few World Affairs Council around the country, and I just love and appreciate what you do. And as Mr. Tomasian said, it really is a microcosm of America that you bring here and help Americans get educated on policy issues. My time is limited, so I'm going to sort of cut to the chase, if you will, and talk about what the Muslim Reform Movement is, what we're doing, and how we came to fruition, and why I believe, and we believe, that it's necessary. I will tell you first, it is important to know what my background is. My family not only escaped the Ba'ath regime, but my grandfather was a businessman and politician in Aleppo. 90-some% of my family is still in Aleppo and Damascus, and is has been, many of you think the revolution started in 2011. Those of us from Syria know that it's been a revolution for over 50 years, that the tyranny basically became much more kinetic in 2011. But at the end of the day, it is about not only my grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, who was the businessman and politician who was in house arrest for years in Syria, but my other grandfather, who was the Supreme Court Sharia judge in Damascus. I believe that this is about legacy. And when we come to America, we have a laboratory to do things that you just can't do in Syria. The work that I do here would have a life expectancy of 2 or 3 months in Syria, and even shorter in Saudi Arabia or Iran. And it's important, I think, and I welcome the opportunity to have this conversation with Salam, because we've been trying to do this for years. I think it's very difficult to have asynchronous communication. But when you have synchronous communication where you're able to exchange ideas at the same time, all of you can then see what diversity is. And unfortunately, diversity in the Muslim community has been defined as ethnic diversity or sectarian diversity between Sunni and Shia, which is not diversity. That's simply racial differences, ethnic differences. That's not ideological diversity. Real diversity, which I feel in our Muslim reform movement has not existed in American Islamic community in a palpable way, is about differences in ideas from fundamentalist to liberal, from those who champion family values to those who champion other values within the community. And we have not had that debate. Unfortunately, when the conversation about Islam in America happens, it's as if we're a monolithic community. Who represents Muslims? What does the Muslim think? And then you check the box, and most of the bandwidth of that conversation ends up being about victimization, bigotry, and this term Islamophobia, a term which we reject at the Muslim Reform Movement because Islam is an idea. It doesn't have any rights. Muslims have rights. Bigotry against Muslims exists. Ideas don't have rights. They don't have protections from the US Constitution, and whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or any faith, the reason that term came out of the 90s and the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which we like to call the neo-caliphate of today, right? I mean, the only thing that brings those countries together is the fact that they're Muslim majority countries that in many different ways, but pretty similar, use the instrument of Sharia law in most of their countries to oppress and tyrannize their people. But unfortunately, the conversation about Islam in America uses this term Islamophobia as if the idea is something to fear, when in fact, if you look in the prisons of Saudi Arabia, the prisons of Iran, in Egypt, in Pakistan, it is that very thing that puts people in jail. And the presidents and kings and tyrants of those countries tell their people that if they criticize the king, it's like criticizing Islam. So in America, what better way by Muslim organizations to invoke blasphemy laws in America than to make you feel that any criticism of Islamic beliefs or doctrine ends up being bigotry against Muslims? That if you question the application of Sharia law inside a mosque, then you become a bigot against Muslims. Yes, real bigotry exists in America against Muslims. But we believe in the Muslim Reform Movement that the best way to fight that bigotry is for all of you to see us leading the fight for reform, to see us admit that we need a 12-step program to realize that violent extremism is a symptom. What does that mean? I don't even know what violent extremism is. It could be gang violence, drug violence, criminal activity, who knows? But if you say violent Islamism, or the battle against the ideas, the theocratic ideas that are the underbelly, then I think you begin to understand what we're fighting. And this is why we need Muslim reform. Because the largest agency in government right now, Homeland Security, which didn't exist before 9/11, now exists to billions of dollars, which are a waste of time of a whack-a-mole program, because all we are dealing with is the last step of radicalization. The entire previous steps that are nonviolent, we don't address. We simply address it about a tactic. And you're not fighting simply extremism or terrorism. Our foundation, the American Islamic Forum, was founded on the need to separate mosque and state. And when we formed it in 2003, people said, "What are you doing? That doesn't make any sense." And then fast forward to 2011, Assad commits genocide against the Sunnis in Syria and slowly radicalizes the population even more than they were after 50 years of his tyranny and his father's tyranny, and you realize that the classic playbook of the Arab dictator is to create radicalized Muslims so that that becomes the foil to legitimize military dictatorship. And our Muslim reform movement is about telling you and teaching Americans that our policy doesn't have to be binary when approaching Muslims, domestically or abroad. That it doesn't have to be simply either the secular dictator who's our ally because we share enemies against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or the Islamists that we sympathize with in the Brotherhood and the viral movements of political Islam. That there can be a third pathway, which we believe is about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, free speech, women's rights, universal values that we share as those who've gone through reform in the West. At the top of our homepage at the American Islamic Forum is a phrase from the Quran, chapter 4, verse 135, that says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُونُوا قَوَّامِينَ بِالْقِسْطِ شُهَدَاء لِلَّهِ وَلَوْ عَلَى أَنفُسِكُمْ أَوْ وَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ. And it says in Arabic translation, believers, conduct yourself with justice and bear true witness before God, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your kin. So at the end of the day, the legacy, this issue of reform to me and to the other 15 Muslim leaders that have helped us form this in Canada, Denmark, UK, and in America, believe that this declaration, which we have available outside, has 2 pages of principles that we believe are the goalposts, if you will, at the end of the field that we need to get to in order to truly counter the theocratic global movement that is fueling the creation of the ISISes, the Hezbollahs of the world, the Al-Qaedas, the Hamases of the world, these militant movements that do things in the name of our religion. It's not my Islam, but it certainly, we have to admit, is a form of Islam that exists. And the only way to counter that is to admit that we need to go through some deep reforms. And that reform is the best form of love, I believe. And it's amazing, if you look out there, a lot of times these conversations degenerate into saying, well, God's religion doesn't need reform. Certainly, yeah. If you believe as a Muslim that Islam is God's religion, God's Islam doesn't need reform. But unless God's whispering to us and He's speaking directly, every interpretation of Islam that exists is a man-made interpretation. And it's man-made interpretation of Scripture, and even the word Sharia is hard to find in the Quran. So our declaration says that we reject institutionalized Sharia. We reject the Islamic State concept. You don't need an Islamic State, and there are many scholars that have talked about this. But the bottom line is the legacy that we leave, and that's what our reform movement is about. What is the legacy that we are going to leave our kids? I have 3 children, 14, 12, and 8. And at the end of my book, I wrote a letter to my kids. And, now we've 15 years post 9/11, 35 years since 1979 when America sort of woke up to what Islamism and political Islam is. And what have we done to fix the core, the cancer within, which is the Islamic State supremacism? No matter how you mollify it, and a state that derives its law from an interpretation of one faith makes every other faith irrelevant in that state. And the only way to treat that is to separate mosque and state. And I think our legacy, I don't want my kids growing up in a country in my absence after I leave this earth, saying that, well, I spent my life working on grievance issues, victimization issues, trying to tell Americans that Islam was not an idea, it was a race, somehow racializing Islam. And that's what happens with the conversation about Islamophobia, is that you racialize an idea. And Islam is not, it's simply an idea that needs to be questioned and criticized. And it's not only the domain of people with degrees in Sharia, ijtihad, which is the critical interpretation of Scripture in light of modern day, at the origin of Islamic history was done by ordinary Muslims who were intellectuals. And I'm not saying it shouldn't, we aren't saying that it shouldn't be rooted in scholarship. But if you look at Reformation of most faiths, the power structure, and as we learned in this last election, the establishment is the last one to change. And the current establishment, this is what our reform movement is about. The current establishment of the Muslim world, our leadership, both domestically and abroad, is the problem. They refuse to recognize the ideological issues, and they refuse to address the issues that need reform. And I hope our legacy will be a new school of thought, because you'll hear denials and apologetics about existence of different legal schools of thought, but as a Sunni Muslim, if you take the 4 legal schools, madhabs, they basically might have differences in how to pray when you're traveling, when to fast, certain other rules. Those are the details. But the big picture about the rights of apostates, should they be killed or not, the rights of blasphemy, anti-blasphemy laws that exist, the rights of women, the interpretation of the passage in the Quran that says that 1 man equals 2 women in a court. These passages that exist need reinterpretation. And reform doesn't mean that you're changing the Arabic. We believe in the authenticity to the comma of every Arabic word. But the question is to separate history from religion. Passages that, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, but passages that may apply to the world in the 7th century, certainly some of which don't apply to today. This is what needs to be done, and the problem, the reason our movement is necessary is these issues that we raise in our declaration, that we signed and taped on the Saudi-funded mosque in Washington, and we've tried to take to every mosque. We've sent a letter to every mosque and Muslim leader that we could find. 5,000 letters were sent out in May 2016 to ask them to sign on, to be signatories, that they as Muslims reject the caliphate, they reject the Islamic State, reject institutionalized Sharia, reject the inequality of men and women, reject oppression based on sexual identity and other issues. These ideas are things that we think Muslims should be held accountable to. Now, the issue is we ask you not to use different values when you talk to Muslims domestically than you do abroad. We should use this concept that somehow, well, we call it a bigotry of low expectations. That somehow you befriend the Saudis and you do nuclear deals with the Iranians, even while you are basically helping hand billions to the genocide in Syria, to a kleptocratic autocracy which is oppressing their people. And then if you say, where are the voices of moderate Islam? They're suppressed by billions globally. And then you hear al-Sisi give a speech about reform, and he's lauded as a reformer, when in fact he's just another dictator, because it's not only what he says, it's what he doesn't say. He talked about reform in what I call the belly of the beast in Al-Azhar University, but he didn't use words like democracy, liberty, freedom, the third pathway that really hasn't existed. And 2.5 years later, or 3 years later now since that speech, surprise, surprise, nothing's happened. And meanwhile, blasphemy laws, imprisonment, journalists losing their rights, etc., continues to happen in Egypt because we continue with this 20th century paradigm. In my last minute, I think we should own this problem. I think Muslims who reject our declaration and say, well, it needs to be done in the halaqas Friday night and not in public, are pushing this. I'm almost 50 years old, 15 years since 9/11. None of this discussion is happening. If it is, I'm missing it. It should be happening on the national networks, not happening in the back of mosques, because women who can't pray in the front of mosques and are told by the misogynistic, paternal, patriarchal societies that they don't have equal rights, that's happening in this country. And when President Obama goes to a mosque in Baltimore that separates men and women, and our reform movement is ignored when we said that you're going to a mosque that has gender apartheid, when people like Ezra Nomani, Shireen, who's here, and others protest the fact that this is not the types of values the president should be endorsing, they're called Islamophobes. We're basically asking for tough love, a fact that basically you can do this from a position of love. And lastly, I want to quote Jefferson, because I think this is really what we're going through. And he said to Epps in 1813, if ever there was a holy war, it was that which saved our liberties and gave us independence. And yes, we live in a free country thanks to our Constitution and the Reformation that the Christian world went through. But within the house of Islam, there is a war, an ideological war that needs to happen. And I think if Muslims sign on and help us with this declaration, they're part of the solution. If they don't, they're in denial and need a 12-step program, and they're part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jasser. And now, Mr. Mariotti, please address the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Let me just jump right into the issue. First of all, I don't accept the premise of the discussion that's called Islam and the West. Just like we said, you can't compare an idea with a policy. You cannot compare a religion with a geography. It's like asking Christianity and the West, are they compatible? Judaism and the West, are they compatible? It's like looking only at Orthodox Jews and saying that they may not be completely integrated into American society. Or at the Amish and saying they're not completely integrated into American society. Or when Catholics were new in this country and looking at the Vatican saying, oh, they have foreign influence, a foreign culture. Or Eastern European Jews and saying the same thing. And theologically and historically, it's not like there's a Judeo-Christian West and an Islamic East. In fact, when we make that division, that's part of the problem. It's not like Moses was born in Paris and Jesus was born in New York. They were born in the Middle East. They were given a message, just like Muslims believe that Muhammad was given a message. Believe in one God, one human family, and do good work. And their common ancestor is Abraham. So part of the problem is the way we look at the problem. We look at the problem in a divisive way, and then it becomes politicized. We need to take the geopolitics out of the discussion, especially when we talk about reform. So what do we mean by reform? Reform means to renew yourself because religion cannot be stagnant. When water becomes stagnant, it creates bacteria. But when it continues to flow, then it is clean water that we can drink from. So we have to move away from the anaerobic process to the aerobic process in looking at this issue. Reform means restoring the ethics and the principles of our faiths. And those are common. They are compassion, justice, human dignity. So let us now look at the 5 characteristics of reform that we believe in. I'm not going to talk about what we're against. I'm going to talk about what we are for. This is what we are for when we talk about reform. Reform means positive, constructive engagement with the rest of society and not to live in ghettos and cocoons and ethnic enclaves. Muslims in Europe live in ethnic enclaves. Muslims in America are highly integrated, highly successful, well-adjusted, educated, and we believe America is our home. Islam can be practiced more freely in America than anywhere else. So that's what we mean by reform, to engage one another, as the Quran says, ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن. Invite people to the way of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful admonition, and when you have discourse, come up with something that is better than what you had originally thought. So the Quran is telling you, don't be dogmatic. Be open and look to what the other side is saying, and then like 2 threads, wrap it around so you come up with something stronger, something better. Number 2, reform means that we have an unequivocal stand for human rights. Because the Quran tells us we have bestowed human dignity on the children of Adam. God has bestowed human dignity. It is my obligation to defend the human rights of every human being, because every human being, in my understanding, has been breathed the Spirit of God in him or her. And our job is to create a free society so that spirit is liberated, not to be shackled by racism, by prejudice, by economic exploitation. and by religious extremism. Number 3, we consider Jews and Christians as people of the book, not as infidels. They are like us, who received a divine revelation, and we are supposed to protect them. We can even marry from among Jews and Christians. We eat from their food because it is lawful to us as Muslims. And so in terms of that Abrahamic understanding, it is the closeness that we have in terms of the divine revelation and the message that we're all given. And as I said earlier, that message is the same. Believe in one God, believe in one human family, and then go and do good work. And the Quran even says, to each of you, you have been given a different way and a different style. So if it were God's will, he would have made you into one, but go and compete with each other to do good work. Then you will be gathered back to God, and he will explain to you what all these differences were about. So God is telling us that there has to be religious pluralism, because he did not create everything the same. There has to be ethnic diversity, because we see the different colors and the different languages. That is not just a part of God's will, but it is something that God wants. It is something that when we strive for God, we are striving for diversity. Number 4, that we consider the emancipation of women as part and parcel and an integral part of the reform movement. We cannot afford to see the oppression of women in our name, in our religion, and using texts to justify oppression. There is what we see in terms of this 2 witnesses, female versus 1. This issue has been resolved already by the theologians. It was at that time, at that place. The permanent principle is there is not only human equality between people, but there has to be gender equality. Eve and Adam were created equally. They sinned together. It wasn't through Eve that Adam sinned, and they were forgiven. The original sin is not by Adam and Eve. The original sin is Satan, who said, I am better than they because I am made out of fire and they are made out of clay. Satan was the first racist. So let us not divide gender and divide race and divide ethnicity and divide religion. And the emancipation of women is a part of our reform movement. The 5th characteristic of reform, then, is that we look forward, not backward. We are not going to be into blind imitation of the past. The great schools of thought were led by people who were progressive thinkers. They were looking forward. They were also opposed to being part of the state. So this idea of separation of the ulama, the scholars in the state, is nothing new. It was Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq who was given the power, the opportunity to take power in the state. He said, no, I am with the people. So when we look at that issue, we see that the tradition of Islamic progressive political thought is that religion should never be a part of any authority or any power. The power and the authority is to take care of security, to put food on the table, to take care of society. Their job is not to play the role of God. And that is one of the main problems that we see in all religions, whether they're talking about the Middle East or the Midwest. It is a problem that people are trying to play the role of God and take the jurisdiction of God in their hands. Muhammad Abdu, a great scholar from Al-Azhar, when he went to France and he came back to Egypt, this is in the 19th century, he said, when he came back to Egypt, he says, I came from a place where there were no Muslims, but there was Islam. And now I'm back to a place where there are Muslims, but no Islam. So Islam is not about the person or the ethnicity or a race. It is about values. It's about the rule of law. It's about human decency. And whether we Muslims are meeting those goals or not, that's the issue. It is we Muslims who need the reform. It is we Muslims who need the reminder. It is we Muslims who must be an integral part of every society that we belong to, because that is the way Islam mandates it and requires us to do. We are supposed to work for justice, no matter what the consequences are. And so when we are dealing with this issue of extremism, people say, why are you letting the extremists hijack your faith? You have to reclaim your faith. And then when I reclaim my faith, I'm called an extremist. When I say jihad does not mean holy war, that's a crusader term. Jihad means struggling or striving, and the major jihad is striving against myself, my base impulses and base desires. Don't let the extremists have the only interpretation of jihad as the interpretation of Islam. You're taking away my right as a Muslim when you do that. When they say, well, this Sharia is trying to creep into American society and we're trying to infiltrate America, which Sharia are we talking about? Sharia means the road. It comes from the Arabic word shari'. All it means the path to God. There is a Jewish path to God, there's a Christian path to God, and there is a Muslim path to God. And within each of that path, there are hundreds of paths. We have more division within each religion than we do between the religions. So there are different paths to God. That's all God is telling us. And that verse that I was reciting to you, to each of you, you have a different way. The words used is Sharia. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً. So he is telling us that we have different ways. So I will reclaim the word Sharia as meaning the path to God, and it is my responsibility to ensure that the Jew, the Christian, the Hindu, the Buddhist, any individual, the atheist, they have the right to be a human being. If they want to worship God, they have that right. And if they don't want to worship God, they have that right. My job is to ensure religious freedom. So that is what the Sharia means to me. It is the Sharia of the golden age of Spain, where Jews and Muslims and Christians were living side by side with one another in religious equality. It is the Sharia that says that we have to work for justice. It is not what that extremist distortion of this term is. And the last thing is the caliphate. There is no requirement in the Quran to establish an Islamic state. The Quran doesn't say go and make a state. The Quran gives principles if you are going to govern, if you are going to rule, here are the principles. But there's no such thing as, oh, this is the Quranic verse that talks about the caliphate. Khilafah simply means vicegerency. Every human being is a vicegerent that was created by God to serve God on earth. It is being the steward of God's creation on earth. It is being his deputy to make sure that someone is standing for the principles of justice and human decency and compassion and mercy in our society. So if we want to work for reform, we have to allow for the Muslims to reclaim their faith and not undermine them by only looking at the extremist distortions of Islam. And I don't even want to say interpretations of Islam. There's no interpretation of Islam that says it's okay to go and murder people. I don't need a fatwa or a declaration to say murder is not allowed in Islam. Murder is murder. I don't care who commits a murder, whether it is regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, whoever the culprit is, whoever the victim is, we have to stand against murder, especially if it's done in the name of anyone's religion. And the last thing I want to say then is that we have 5 goals of Sharia. Every scholar agrees on these 5 goals: to protect life, to defend freedom of expression, to promote freedom of religion, to allow every human being to have the right to property, and to make understood everyone's lineage in their own family. Who are your parents? Who who are your family members. Those are the 5 goals of Sharia. What people look at is the interpretation of Sharia. That is where we're talking about. And reform means interpret it according to your time and place. And we're not going to look at, we don't have a pope. We're not going to look at one person that tells us what that's supposed to be. It is supposed to be done collectively among the people. And radical reform means that we have opinions where we bring all experts on any issue. And as Tariq Ramadan writes in his book on radical reform, that means you can include non-Muslims in the discussion to come up with an opinion that fits the context of your circumstance. This is the new era. America is that opportunity that it is giving us that way to redefine, restore the ethics, and renew ourselves so that Islam in the West is an integral, vibrant, and effective component in society. It is not Islam and the West. It is the American understanding of Islam that we have to develop. Therefore, we must liberate ourselves from the governments and the religious establishments overseas and find our own authenticity as Muslims who have the right to define Islam for ourselves and for our fellow American citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Marayati. And now, in accord with our forum for this evening, Dr. Jasser, you'll be given 5 minutes. You could do it from there if you'd like. It might be easier. And then, Mr. Marayati, you'll be able to give 5 minutes to respond. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I've asked one of our trustees and executive board members, Mark Chapin-Johnson, to handle the Q&A. He has received the questions. One of the things this evening is Dr. Santosh Mohanty will be able to ask the first question, and then we will go to the Q&A. So go ahead.
Thank you. There were a number of points raised, but I think also in the interest of time, the question is not convincing all of you that Islam is peaceful and giving you the apologetics that Islam 101 about what the Islam is that we believe in that isn't a threat. I think that is a loss of time. It's a loss of bandwidth. The question is, do we recognize and acknowledge what the problem is? Because if you're going to treat, I'm a physician, I treat disease. In order to give the patient the right treatment, I have to diagnose it correctly. It's not just a question of modernity or West versus, it's not West versus Islam. This is a battle within Islam. But what are we fighting? We're fighting theocracy. So we can give bromides about the ability to modernize interpretation and quote, yes, what is reform? Who owns reform? Imam Qardawi, who's very close to Tariq Ramadan, they do what I call Islamism 4.0, 5.0, in which they modernize, or in a way some call them neo-Salafists, which is they believe in the Salafi tradition, Salaf meaning the friends of the Prophet, but they modernize it in a way to appear modern, but yet continue to not allow reason-based secular systems to exist versus exegetical systems to exist. So the question is not whether we can find modern exegetical ways to interpret Islam. The question is, what are we teaching our kids is the thing they should die for? Because right now the jihadists, and this is why the movement's necessary, and I saw, the Salam is talking about reform movements, etc., so we're trying to dilute it. Our Muslim reform movement is about this declaration. And until Muslims acknowledge, ummah, for example, the word ummah, which is all over the Quran, it means faith community, but it also means state. And until we call out Muslim groups and call out Harikat Islamiyya, he can say that Islam separates mosque and state, there's nothing against it. But unless he identifies by name Hamas, Hezbollah, Jamaat Islamiyya, the Muslim Brotherhood, the saying, the motto of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin is that Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. Until our Muslim organizations in the belly of freedom here start using our bandwidth and their monies and our monies to fight this motto, we're wasting our time. Because you can sit and talk to a wonderful, friendly audience about how modernized Islam is, but the reality is you have large populist movements of Ikhwan that won an election in Egypt. Khomeinis that had a revolution that believe Everything he said is wrong about modernity, etc. And unless you identify those viral movements, and then the mafia heads of the Saudi regime, the King Salmans of the world, the Khameneis of the world, the al-Sisis of the world, who are basically no different because they're feeding the same Sharia interpretations that are very dogmatic, but they're not. We have to identify not only ISIS, but all Islamic states as the problem. And until my children see the concept of the Islamic State in the dustbin of history, we're not going to see. And the other thing I think is important to discuss is the fact that nonviolent anti-Semitism, nonviolent homophobia, nonviolent misogyny that exists in the mosques in this country, all of a sudden after Orlando, all the Muslim groups were saying how they were hand in hand with the gay community, when in fact the mosque the president visited has a screed against homosexuals that was from the sermon at that mosque in Baltimore. And yet somehow they all of a sudden became all about gay rights. And yet we ignore the fact that there are huge problems of a lack of acknowledgement that there are interpretations from our scripture that we need to spend our resources on every day. Yes, address bigotry, but I think 95% of our time needs to be spent on addressing our own community domestically and using that as a platform to address it globally. You have Erdogan's daughter who came and gave a huge speech to a large Islamic organization in America just 4 weeks ago. And Erdogan himself said, democracy is like a train. You use it until you get where you want to go, and then you get off. That's the problem with political Islam, is that it's a one-way street. They may give you apologetics about how it works and democratically, Sharia. The ulama is a sort of a consortium of moderate scholars that works like a democracy. But as long as the rules of the road are exegesis for Muslims, that puts Jews, atheists, Christians, everyone who's non-Muslim out of the picture because the rules are about Sharia. They're not about reason. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Marotti, same thing. We're going to go 5 minutes, and then we're
Sure.
going to open up to Q&A.
Sure. First of all, I want to make very clear, I couldn't care less for the Muslim Brotherhood, and I believe that political Islam is a failure. But I also believe those that are trying to make that the issue, okay, that's the problem, I think they're completely wrong. And they are apologists for whatever political financiers, patrons they have, either in Washington or wherever. They did that, by the way, they did that against the Bosnians. They said that's political Islam. Izetbegovic is a Muslim Brotherhood. The genocide took place against the Bosnian people. So this is a way of demonizing and dehumanizing the Muslim people. It is a political ploy. And as J.M. Berger, a counterterrorism analyst at George Washington University Program on Extremism, about this whole Muslim Brotherhood, it's now the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's go look for the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's blame the Muslim Brotherhood. We'll blame Cain as being Muslim Brotherhood for what he did to Abel. This approach will get us nowhere. He said, this initiative is concerned with controlling American Muslims, not with any issue pertaining to the Muslim Brotherhood in any practical or realistic sense. And then when you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, which Muslim Brotherhood are you talking about? The group in Egypt that won an election and they couldn't even control Egypt? You expect that group to be controlling America? It's a joke. The group in Turkey that now our Secretary of State is saying we need to have stronger ties with Erdogan? Oh, he's Muslim Brotherhood. The group in Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi, who basically says, I'm not going to take political power because I care more for my country. I will work for constitutionalism in my country. So we can't have this blanket assessment and imposition. And then you come to me and apply this litmus test on me, and you call this democracy? No. I couldn't care less for them, and I couldn't care less for the way you're trying to distort my faith, and I couldn't care less for your litmus test. because they're all illiberal, undemocratic, and will only create more problems and more confusion for the American public. It will drive a further wedge, and we're going to have the ghettoization of Muslims in America like they are ghettoized in Europe. If not physically, psychologically. So apologetics, you want to take money from anti-Muslim extremists and then come and lecture us about apologetics? You want to say that the Palestinians should be completely submissive to what's happening to them in the occupied territories because your supporters are, you have to pass that litmus test on being Netanyahu's darling, and darling with his cronies in Washington, with APAC and those people? No, we will have Muslim-Jewish dialogue, Muslim-Christian dialogue, to have sense when we talk about the Middle East, not to impose one ideology on anyone else. And so let's talk about, we want to be America first? Okay, let's be America first on this. What is in America's interests? And that's what we should be committed to. We want to fight terrorism. Let's name terrorism then. You want to ignore how right-wing extremists have been responsible for 4 times more killings than ISIS, Al-Qaeda type extremists since 9/11? You want to ignore that and just say, oh, it's the Muslim community that has the problem. You want to stigmatize the Muslim community. No, I will not be stigmatized. I will stand up proudly for my faith and for my country and for my children. That is what is going to make my children proud of being Americans and being Muslims. They're not going to have this false choice. Oh, to be a good American, you need to just water down your Muslim stuff. No, they're going to be proud American Muslims. And as our founder said, the American Muslim identity is defined by where home is. Home is not where my grandparents are buried. Home is where my grandchildren are going to be raised. Thank you.